4546b is filled with a glorious diversity of life, but not all critters are created the same. I'm a real-life marine ecologist and internet gaming YouTuber, so here is my scientific gamer analysis of all of the living things the world of Subnautica has to offer. Acid mushrooms are among the first lifeforms you see in the game, and are the first biotic material you're taught is useful. Such an important gameplay mechanic must be accompanied by an equally impressive, yet unassuming design, and I think the acid mushroom nails that. Its cupped, vibrant appearance makes it a stark contrast to the tans of the safe shallows. While fungi are far from my personal favorite kinds of creatures, they are undeniably important, and from my limited knowledge on fungal species, the acid mushroom makes a certain degree of sense. Add the fact that they do burst into clouds of noxious gas whenever you hit them with a knife or yeet them with a propulsion cannon, and you've got some cool flora that lands solidly in the A tier. Next is the amoeboid, these large bulbous creatures you find along the Lost River's floor. The only interesting thing about these oversized, single-cellular organisms is that they canonically feed on fossilized organic matter, aka rocks, which makes no sense, but they also go through mitosis apparently, so there's that. They serve no real purpose other than to decorate the floor, and frankly, I wish there was more to them. D tier. Amphiols have the potential to be so much cooler than they really are, but they're going in the C tier for a number of reasons. This idea is clearly inspired by the electric eel, a real-life earth fish that sends out shocks of electricity to stun its prey. Notably, the actual real-life electric eels only exist in freshwater because electricity will travel too well through saltwater, electrocuting the water rather than the fish you're trying to stun. That's why electroshocking is a somewhat common sampling method for people studying river fishes, but would very rarely make sense for a scientist working in a salt marsh. Aesthetically, the amphiols are definitely unique, but they don't have enough in-game utility, and their mismatched ecology make me not a huge fan of them. Unlike the anchorpods, which I am a big fan of. These are definitely one of the more atmospheric life forms as opposed to the more practical ones, but this particular flora design is among the more unique biomes that the Subnautica universe has to offer. As the PDA notes, the large pods are gaseous, and supposedly when the plant matures, the pod will burst and send out spores to propagate more big pods, which is very similar to how puffball mushrooms spread around. The anchor pods are much prettier in color though, and I like the fact that they actually have a described and viable life cycle, so they're going in the B tier. I would argue that biters are the perfect example of something that's a nuisance without being too overbearing. They randomly appear next to you, do a tiny bit of damage, you whack them, and they move along. Their shape somewhat reminds me of a male anglerfish before it parasitizes a female, which the small lure on top of their head doesn't really help. That's about the only interesting thing about them though, so C tier. Bladderfish are another abundant, shallow water fish that you'll encounter plenty of, and likely use plenty of in a normal playthrough, considering they're found all over the starting biomes and can be used to craft the earliest consistent source of water. Interestingly, raw bladderfish can be consumed underwater to give you 15 points of oxygen, and that can alleviate some early game diving pressure. While that's cool from a gameplay perspective, having a ton of gas, especially in a mix that somehow converts to breathable air, doesn't make a lot of sense in a fish that needs to keep itself submerged in a much denser saltwater. They also have very little structure that could conceivably change their overall density that much, let alone explain their high mobility and small size. So while I would put its gameplay utility in S tier, its ecology is a solid D tier, so we're going to average those two out and call it B tier. B for bladderfish. Where biters are minimally annoying, the bleeders are significantly more so, seeing as they like to attach themselves to your arm and slowly drain your health away. It's more annoying because it stops you from using whatever tool you were using, forcing you to remove it before you can do anything else. Couple that with the fact that the place you're most likely to encounter them in a substantial quantity is inside of the Aurora's reactor room while repairing the drive cores. The only redeeming factor of the bleeder is that they have the same aggression towards other fauna and continue feeding on the carcass after an animal has passed, which makes them a cool example of continuous behavior that aligns with their organismal design, which is a somewhat limited combination in this game. So the opposite of the bladderfish, the in-game design is annoying at best, but the ecology is super cool. So again, we balance it to a B tier, B for bleeder. The blighter is a reskinned version of the biters that you can find in some of these slightly deeper, less vibrant biomes, where they're a little more drab and a little more gnarly to represent their new habitat. Supposedly, they're less likely to form packs than biters are, and they might be blind. But there's too little difference in actual observable behavior, and just a minor reskin to justify any better of a score than its counterpart, so it's also going in C tier. Also found around the blood kelp zone, the aptly named blood crawlers are one of shockingly few invertebrates that we find in this part of 4546b. They're essentially all of the scary parts about spiders, except the number of legs and the relative body shape. As someone who is absolutely horrified by spiders, but absolutely loves crabs, I especially hate the fact that they have chelicera and not mandibles, because all crabs, and all true crustaceans, are mandibulates. Also because the PDA says it moves its mandibles, but those are not mandibles. Chelicera are specialized mouthparts that are designed to grasp and hold onto food while eating. Mandibles are more meant for cutting, chewing, or otherwise processing food. According to the PDA, they use their mouthparts to hold onto their prey for feeding, making these chelicera. These guys fall into my gray zone for spider crabs for that reason. Also, they're not dissimilar in size to spider crabs. But before I go on too much of a rant on deep sea ecology and the evolution of crabs, I think they're fairly atmospheric, and I think they have a place in bottom feeder ecology, even if we never get to see them fulfill that role. So, B tier. B for blood crawler. The blood vine and blood kelp found in that same blood kelp biome are again atmospheric, large flora, and they have the necessary utility of providing blood oil, which is a mid to late game crafting resource that's needed for several key recipes. But personally, I find there's too much wrong with the design of these so-called plants to enjoy being in their presence too much. And it's not even because the PDA tells me that this biome has 7 of the 9 preconditions for stimulating terror in humans, it's because these should be considered fauna and not flora, but that's a lot to discuss for this video. While Bloodroot and Bloodvine are different scans, and they're different entities in the PDA, even their entries affirm that they are the same flora species, so I'm gonna lump them together. And they're going in C for should have been cryonoids, because that would have made a lot more sense. Blue palms are an incidental decor plant, usually found neighboring acid mushrooms in the safe shallows. They're one of a few plants you can transfer into grow beds to use to decorate your base exterior, but beyond that, they're pretty simple organisms. I'd like to think they're closer to a coral or anemone than any true flora species, with adapted limbs for filter feeding alongside something like the zooxanthellae in corals that allows certain animals to photosynthesize. Overall, nice decorative clutter, but could be a lot cooler for ecology. So B tier. B for blue palm. I recently opened a time capsule about Lulu the bone shark that may slightly alter my opinion of these open water predators, but I do think the bone shark is one of the more interesting alien designs that makes sense at a biological level. It's aptly named, with the chitinous overlapping segments, and a design that's undeniably similar to many sharks from Earth. It's often seen chasing prey, or attempting to destroy my sea moth when I get too close to the edge of the mushroom forest. Overall, I think it's a solid design that serves its purpose and has both real utility and believable ecology. A tier. The boomerang fish is one of the swarming early game food fish species you'll find in most of the early game regions. It's not dissimilar to a real-life discus fish or angelfish, although its teeth are a little bit concerning. According to the PDA, they're used to eat corals, which is something that a few real-life fish do. Namely a few species of parrotheads, and those also have concerning teeth and beaks for other reasons. That being said, I find it feasible that boomerangs are corallivores, and that they exist around the coral-populated areas of 4546b, so they make sense as a fish overall. A tier. As you explore the Lost River, you may notice these tiny little brine lilies poking above parts of the noxious green liquid. These lilies are purely decorative, but in terms of ecology, there is exceptionally little chance that something like this could exist in any normal world. Haloclines are a real phenomena that happens when two bodies of water meet, but are unable to mix due to a variety of factors, like temperature, salinity, density, dissolved oxygen content, etc. As such, these haloclines, particularly one that is toxic to any kind of vertebrate life that interacts with it, is most likely to be similar to a brine pool that you'd find in the deep dark deep down. And those have a reputation for being a little grim and killing any living thing that comes in contact with it. As such, any kind of plant is exceptionally unlikely to survive that kind of environment. So while they're a cool decoration to fill the space, they're not my favorite because the halocline could have stood on its own. C tier. The bulb zone is definitely an alien biome in the fact that it's so unlike anything from our planet. And of course, the actual bulb bushes are a major contributing factor in that. These almost fluffy, slightly shimmery balls are fantastic for setting the mood, but their in-game science doesn't match what we actually see. The PDA says that the bulbbush has evolved to live in deep, sandy environments, which I'll grant, but it also says that the bulbbush has evolved to conserve water levels against extreme temperatures, which we just don't see around the bulb zone, nor do we see any bulbbushes next to any area with extreme temperatures. I don't personally enjoy when the in-game lore doesn't match up with what we actually see, so that's enough to take it from an A tier to a B tier. B for bulbbush. Finally, moving on to one of the very few terrestrial organisms, the bulbo tree is one of the most useful land-based life forms in the original Subnautica, mostly because it's a fairly decent source of food and water, and it's abundant on either island, making it an excellent last resort if you want to keep exploring but forgot your water bottle at home. The trees are fairly sound from an ecology standpoint. I just personally don't like the way their bases leak, so they're going in A tier. I've already given my thoughts on the blood crawler, and the cave crawler is pretty much the same thing, except you find them mostly on land. My only issue on the cave crawler specifically is that we find comparatively few of them in caves, and comparatively a lot of them roaming out in the open. I think just crawler would have sufficed. But they're still not sufficiently different enough from blood crawlers to warrant a different score, so they're also going in the B tier. Cave bushes are a pretty straightforward decorative plant. They're pretty, they provide nice low-level lighting, and they make good base decorations. A tier. The Chinese potato is one of 3 primary farmable food types, and while it's meant to be the hardiest with the most food to water of the growable food types, I also find it to be the least consistent in an actual playthrough. Theoretically, there's nothing wrong with these being on 4546B, as they were canonically imported by the crew of the Degassi as a growable food, so whether or not they fit the planet is irrelevant. It's still a useful plant, and I like things that I can grow inside, so B tier. The giant cove tree is, without a doubt, the single coolest area in all of Subnautica. There's so much I could say about its niche and place in the world, but you'll have to wait into my deep dive for this game's marine ecology to hear more about that. S tier. The crabclaw kelp is one of 3 non-crab organisms that has the word crab in its name, and just like the brine lilies, you can find them scattered throughout parts of the Lost River. For the same reasons as the brine lilies, I'm not a huge fan, but I would say the quote-unquote kelp variety makes more sense as its bottom is anchored and extends above the halocline, making it ever so slightly more viable, and for that it gets one step up to a B tier. The crab snake is the second non-crab crab entity, and these long guys can only be found in the jelly shroom caves. Functionally, they fill the niche of being an ambush, eel-like predator that generally waits for prey to be close and unsuspecting before it strikes. This behavior is fairly common amongst more sessile predators, with notable examples like most big eel species, certain species of benthic sharks like wabbagongs, and even the bobbit worm, which I think is a closer cousin to the crab snake than anything in all of Pancrustacea. So while I really like the design and the behavior of the crab snake, it really irritates me that they didn't go for some other name that more closely represents the animal itself, like mentioning eels or worms over snakes that distinctively lack any kind of appendages or fins. And also, just because you gave it something closer to mandibles doesn't make it a crab. A tier. Crab squids are the final non-crab crab entity, but I do like the crab squid design quite a lot, and I would say it's the closest to any entity gets to being crab-like. The crab squid is also the closest we get to any true cephalopod anywhere in Subnautica, with its distinct mantle-like head and many assorted limbs. Ironically, this crab squid also has the most functional crab-like parts in those 10 segmented limbs, and particularly the 2 modified claws that the crab squid uses for eating. True crabs are decapods, so having 10 believable limbs on the armored carapace makes this by far the most believable example of carcinization on 4546B. Though the mouth is somewhat ambiguous and doesn't match the mandibles of crustaceans, nor the beaks of most cephalopods. I like the clear mantle and the visible stomach inside, and it's a fairly plausible design for a light-sensitive creature, like a barrelfish that also has a clear head. I do hate when they disable my seamoth though. A tier. The bane of early game exploration, crashfish are always lurking in their little nests, waiting to pounce on you and explode just as you pick up your first sandstone outcropping. Gameplay-wise, they're a nice early challenge when you first start to worry about going deeper, but their ecology makes very little sense. Their entire defense strategy is kind of similar to pufferfish, with the key difference that pufferfish actually have a chance to survive the encounter, whereas crashfish are more of a said and done kind of deal. They formed a symbiotic relationship with the sulfur plants to nest inside of them, and the sulfur plant is the infinitely more interesting half of that duo. The fish use the sulfur plants as nests, and the nests feed on the waste created by the fish. This plant evolved more or less the same relationship with the crashfish that the anemone did with the clownfish. On that note, sulfur plants are leaning more and more into the same category as anemones, which again, are animals and not plants. I think the sulfur plant and the crashfish have to go together as one entity, because there wouldn't be one without the other. And while I like their relationship and the way that their symbiosis is described, I hate the crashfish too much to let it slide. So C tier overall. C for crashfish, even. The creepvine stalks leering in the distance when you exit your life pod for the first time are the first indicator to the player that the world of 4546b is much more diverse than the Safe Shallows lets on. And entering the biome for the first time, the PDA will even tell you that everything in this world grows in distinct ecological biomes. As a real-life marine ecologist, kelp forests are my favorite ecosystem on our planet, and that love carries over into the game. Although admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of the seaweed itself, because I am deathly allergic to it. That being said, it is fairly evident that the creepvine forests function much the same way that kelp forests do on Earth. There's ample biodiversity, plenty of natural resources, and frankly, I just find this biome calming. While the creepvine itself is nothing special, it's a fairly standard stalked kelp, but my love for the kelp forest biome knows no bounds, so it's going in S tier. And we're going to immediately follow that up with another S-tier creature, the beloved cuttlefish. These little fellows are the closest you'll get to having a friend on this lonely world, and they're pretty darn cute. Aside from their adorable interactions, their ecology and biology is limited by the fact that the PDA doesn't even know if the species is from this planet or not, and that there are no wild specimens to be studied to obtain information from. We do know that it's an herbivore who likes crackers, and that it's playful, social, and has high levels of attachment. All of which make it the perfect companion, but its ecology is unknown. I'm still keeping it in the S tier though, because it's cute. Deep shrooms are, shockingly, the deep water equivalent of the acid mushrooms encountered in the shallower biomes. There's little that's different about them aside from their coloration, and we can imply that some form of bleaching occurred as an evolutionary adaptation to a lack of sunlight and a reduced need to produce pigment for camouflaging or some other effect that the acid mushrooms needed that pigment for. Because they're essentially the same, they're getting the same score. A tier. Also in the list of organisms that the game calls flora but should definitely be considered fauna are the drooping stingers. The PDA will tell you that this so-called plant has absolutely no photosynthetic capacity, and that it is 100% carnivorous. While carnivorous plants do exist, I think the parallels to cnidarians and some other jelly-like creatures is too strong to ignore. Kind of like the way that people assume coral is a plant when it is in fact a very dense collection of tiny animal polyps, but we'll get more into that later. The interesting fact about the drooping stinger is that, unlike cnidarians, which are called that because of their cnidocyte harpoon cells, the drooping stinger will shock its prey with electricity. This is inefficient for the same reasons I discussed with the amp eel, and even though 600 watts is higher than the average backpack electrofisher, it still likely wouldn't do too much in this saline of an environment, particularly when there is no stated mechanism for this quote-unquote plant to hold onto its prey over the weeks that it takes to consume. While I like the drooping stingers aesthetically, their ecology is all over the place at best. Plus, they're annoying when my controller is being wonky. So, C tier. Eye stalks are arguably one of the most alien-looking creatures on 4546b, although for some reason, they always make me think of potatoes. These tubers are bioluminescent, making them a viable option for lighting up the outside of your sea base, although they only have one notable in-game use. Interestingly, the PDA alludes that the eye spots are photosensitive and may contribute to some phototropic behavior in the eye stalk plant, but that's about the only interesting thing it's got going for it. B tier. Eye eyes are a common prey fish in many biomes, and 90% of their body is dedicated to one massive eye. The PDA suggests that this is a kind of ancestral peeper, or at least that the two share a common ancestor. Realistically, between this fish's lack of maneuverability and the huge energistic deficit in trying to use an eye specialized for low light conditions in bright, abundant areas, means this creature would have gone extinct rather quickly. We also have no clue how it even eats in the first place, because it doesn't show any kind of mouth or anything beyond its eye and fins. I like this design from a video game standpoint as a unique animal, but it just isn't viable on a biological level, so it's going to go in the C tier. The fern palm is particularly interesting for a few reasons. One, it is the rarest growable plant in the game, and you can only find it in one particular place. Two, it may or may not be from this planet, as it's not listed in any existing flora databases, but shares some genetic code with local plant life. The plant itself makes a decent amount of sense and is a believable tree design, and I like the fact that this game doesn't quite know what to make of it. Plus, it's one of the best interior design plants. It's going in the A tier. Floaters are quite possibly one of the funniest organisms in Subnautica for the way that you can make any predator start floating to the surface, but their ecology is also fairly interesting. It turns out these little guys are a combination of two species working symbiotically. The main pink body is parasitic, sucking nutrients out of whatever it's attached to, and the translucent goo is a mesh of microorganisms that create a vacuum seal and theoretically supply the helium that make these guys so buoyant. All in all, this isn't something that's believable in real-life organisms, because the volume of helium needed to lift not only the organism itself, but with its lift force on other items just isn't feasible. Also, it's kind of hard to suck nutrients out of rocks. Take that concept and multiply it when it comes to the giant, ancient floaters. At this point, you're encountering these same issues with the surface area to volume ratios that are roughly the same reason why we no longer have massive insects on Earth. I think the design of the floaters is really cool, and I like that the devs implemented a few forms of symbiosis, but the design not being at all feasible does subtract a little bit of my enjoyment. And for that, the floaters are going into the B tier. The furled papyrus is one of many incidental plants you're likely to not pay too much attention to, and it's found in the vast majority of the slightly deep biomes. Overall, the PDA suggests that its curled leaves may unfurl to increase photosynthetic capacity in low light conditions, or that it may use it to funnel water currents through the body of the plant, kind of like a sea sponge. Either way, it's a cool incidental plant that I wish we had more info on. B tier. Similarly, Gabe's feather is another deep water decorative plant that supposedly filters and feeds excretions from nearby fauna, which is a fairly realistic and believable marine plant design. Although the level of information and ecology we have for the feather is roughly the same as the furled papyrus, I really don't like the fact that it looks like chubby little ghost hands, so it's going in the C tier. Back in the safe shallows, the Garyfish is the next early game food source you're likely to rely on in the first steps of your journey. And that's mostly the role that Garyfish is meant to fill, considering its unique patterning is meant as a kind of camouflage. There are some real-life fish with eye stalks, so this design isn't impossible. And I like that they included some kind of normal prey fish as a baseline food source for some of the other mesopredators. A tier. This is going to be a controversial take, but I don't love the gasopods. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love their name, which is a clear allusion to gastropods, or gastropoda, the class that snails, slugs, and a variety of other critters belong to. But I hate the fact that these guys don't deserve that name, because in no way could they be construed to belong to that class. It's very clever, but the lack of correlation to the source material, combined with the utter lack of invertebrate diversity in these oceans, makes me wish that we did have some kind of snail-like critter instead. In terms of their actual behavior and ecology, the gasopods are much more similar to a manatee or sea cow, which makes me want to like them because I like those real-life animals, but I do not like it when they drop their gasopods on me. So I consider the gasopods to be a case of bait and switch. I really like their concept on paper, and it's a totally valid animal design, and I actually like the way they operate in-game. They just need a different name, and I want them to be my friends instead of trying to gas me. So combine those mixed feelings for an overall A tier. Gel sacks are easily one of the most useful plant forms on 4546b, both because they're used in advanced crafting, and also because they make a great backup food source in many of the later game biomes. Supposedly, the reproduction for these guys is similar to what we covered with the bulb bushes, where the little purple areas are filled with spores that periodically explode, and while we never see that in-game, it's nice to have that kind of biology included in the lore. A useful, convenient plant that isn't too memorable in its own right, but is definitely nice to have around. B tier. The Ghost Leviathan, or Phil as I like to call it, is one of the more prominent aggressive figures you'll find in Subnautica's oceans, and you're forced to encounter at least one on your journey through the Lost River. Surprisingly, these guys are only the juvenile versions of a much larger Leviathan that you can find along the crater's edge. So large, in fact, that the PDA will tell you these guys are, quote, approaching the size limit for sustainable organic life forms. While these big boys are apparently filter feeders in the same vein as whale sharks, the juveniles are a bit scarier predators that go after imp eels, ghost rays, and apparently even other juvenile ghosties. My real issue with the ghost leviathans is their rostrum, aka the big flat part that resembles a hammerhead. This kind of morphology only makes sense for aggressive predators that hunt in certain conditions, very few of which are actually applicable in the Lost River, and none of which are applicable for the adult ghost leviathan's life stage. That rostrum is a huge energy deficit for any large animal, and given the fact that the adult ghosties aren't even true predators, makes this even less viable as an organismal design. Plus, their whole life cycle of being an egg at the Cove Tree, a juvenile in the Lost River, and an adult at the crater's edge is all well and good storytelling, but it doesn't explain how these massive animals then get back to the Cove Tree to reproduce again. This is also getting filed into the list of things I could talk about in depth in a different video, but the TLDR is that their life cycle and morphology just don't make sense. That being said, they are still one of the most iconic and terrifying creatures in these oceans, and for that, they're still going into the S tier. On the other hand, the prey of the juvenile ghost leviathan around that same breeding ground is one of my favorite creature designs in this game. Ghost rays are the Lost River version of some of the other rays I'll talk about in a little bit, and they are used to create the mystical ambiance of the Cove Tree, again making this room easily one of the top 3 locations on 4546B. I am a big fan of all sorts of rays in real life, and these ghost rays are fairly similar to how they appear in our oceans. They feed on detritus, which makes sense for a deep-sea herbivore, and they're simply beautiful. Also an S-tier animal. Ghostweed falls strongly into the category of, I wish we knew more about this, because all the PDA has to say is that it grows in deep water where its pale pigmentation is visible on the fewest wavelengths, aka that it's pale like me in the winter, and that's all of the information that we get. It's a pretty cool looking plant, and I would like to know more about it before making a true judgment call. So for now, it's going to go in the middle of the pack in B tier. Grub baskets are one of the few terrestrial fungus-type flora found around the floating island. According to the PDA, it's possible this is a carnivorous plant that uses a proteinous sludge to trap insects inside its basin, so that's pretty cool. It's not my favorite of the terrestrial plants, but I appreciate that it's at least unique. A tier. Grue clusters are the little glowy bits you'll find around the mushroom forest. They create some nice ambience, but we know literally nothing about them since there isn't even a PDA entry for them. While we're here, I'm also including the tree spawn clusters that we also know nothing about, but are similarly a pretty glowy thing around the mushroom forest. Both of them are still pretty cool though. B tier. Much like the garryfish, polefish are small herbivores found in various caves around some of the early game biomes, and also like the garryfish, are patterned to blend in with their surroundings. Supposedly, the hole in their fin makes it easier for them to maneuver unpredictably, and that's why these little buggers are so hard to scan. They're a cool little fish to find, so A tier. Hoopfish also fit into that same category of small herbivore prey fish, but these guys are far more widespread around 4546B. Hoopfish are also one of the only truly schooling fish we see here in these oceans, and supposedly they are adapted to camouflage best at dusk and dawn. Though I'm pretty sure that to human eyes they stick out like a sore thumb wherever they are. Theoretically, the hoopfish is supposed to sail through the water by altering the composition of the water in front of it, which absolutely would not work in any real fish, but it's a cool design concept. And supposedly, they're also distant relatives of the bladderfish. I mostly like them because they're the only prey fish we see exhibiting preyfish behaviors, so A tier. Hoverfish are an easy S tier. Just look at their little faces. Plus, they do have some real camouflaging in their environment, and they're cute. The hoverpad limbs would be more practical in an organism that is near or above the surface, kind of like how certain nudibranchs will glide along the surface tension at the top of a tide pool, and that design is less practical for a free-swimming fish-like salamander creature. However, because they are so cute, they still get the S tier. The Jaffa Cup is D tier. Something about it just makes me uncomfortable. The mushroom forest is easily one of the most iconic and recognizable Subnautica biomes, and a central aspect of making that biome as unique as it is the jelly rays floating about, elevating the mystical feeling of giant underwater glowing trees. Much like the ghost rays, I'm partially biased from my love of real-life rays, so these guys are similarly going into the S tier. The jelly shrooms are the most iconic element of the jelly shroom caves for reasons that should be obvious. These glowing purple mushroom trees have a potentially symbiotic relationship to the crab snakes we talked about earlier, acting as nests for both the adults and the eggs. They're the central feature of one of the most unique biomes in the game, and for that, I think they deserve an A tier. The lantern tree fruit is arguably the best renewable food source in the game, despite the fact that the PDA would tell you the exact opposite. It can only be found on the floating island, but its ability to grow a full tree in a small crop plot is one of the best ways to keep yourself fed and hydrated in the mid to late game. It's also a necessary part of good base decor. A tier. The lava larvae are the single most annoying creature in all of Subnautica, and their design boils down to a leech that sucks electricity instead of blood. Even though they are called larvae, we never get any sense of what they could potentially grow into, which is why I think their design is much more suited to a leech or a lamprey than to an actual larval creature. And while they are supposedly drawn to thermal and electrical energy to feed, I don't see them attaching to anything other than my Cyclops to feed off of when there are plenty of thermal vents that are undeniably producing more energy than my struggling single power cell. D tier. The lava lizards, however, fit the lava zones much better, seeing as they have whole parts of burned scar tissue covering their back. Supposedly, that enables them to withstand the greater temperatures, and they can deal with other threats with those large protruding teeth. While the inactive and active lava zones are undoubtedly exceptionally harsh environments to survive in, there are real-life marine animals that exist near and around active volcanoes in our oceans, so it's not entirely impossible that something like lava lizards could evolve to thrive in these conditions. Also, lava lizards are an even bigger warper hater than I am, and they will actively pursue those guys instead of the player if given the opportunity, which has to earn them at least 1 bonus point. And for that, they're going in the A tier. Also in the lava zones, you can find the lava versions of the other rays, and you'll never guess where I'm going to put them. A tier, but only because I don't actually like the lava zones. Magmarangs are the lava zone version of the boomerangs we talked about earlier, but given that those shallow water fish were corallivores, and there is a distinct lack of coral this deep down, clearly there must be something else these fish are eating, but we get no clues as to what. That lack of continuity and lack of explanation for how these fish could be surviving here is enough to knock them down a tier compared to their shallow water version. B tier. As much as I love the lantern tree, the marble melon is certainly a worthy contender for the best farmable food source. These plants supposedly collect water from the air rather than from their roots to grow the melon. Kind of like the Chinese potato, it's implied that these plants were imported due to the fact that they can only be found in grow beds around Degassi bases, although it's not explicitly stated for the melons the same way it is for the potatoes. That being said, I could easily see melons of any kind evolving alongside the bulbo trees. Overall, A tier. The membrane tree is one of the more unique and aesthetically pleasing plant designs in the game. Supposedly, the entity is composed of multiple coral species that created a tiny ecosystem within the membrane, and they would quickly die if exposed to the outside world. Basically, it's a mini terrarium that's also symbiotic with its inhabitants. The only thing that gives me pause about the membrane containing coral is that coral itself inherently contains other little microorganisms called zooxanthellae that give them photosynthetic capabilities, and this might be one layer of endosymbiosis too many. It's a very pretty plant-animal thingy, and I would like to know more about it before passing too much judgment on its feasibility. A tier. The mesmer is potentially the scariest animal on 4546b, and hear me out on why. While most of Subnautica's aggressive creatures rely on being big, bad, and dangerous to approach, the mesmer actively lures you into its trap by manipulating the way that you think. You'll hear your own PDA, your only trusted voice on this planet, telling you to get closer, drawing you in until it's too late. It's not entirely unlike the way cuttlefish operate, minus the telepathy. Even the PDA is smitten by these little guys. The extent to which this hunting strategy is realistic is limited, but seeing as I've already given you one real-world example of a similar strategy, it's safe to say that an alien may have a greater capability of inflicting that kind of treatment on humans. A tier. According to the PDA, the Ming plant self-repairs over time, and that's what gives it this cracked appearance. Realistically, this probably just means that it grows kind of in the same way that tree bark does, and that's why it looks cracked and jagged. These plants aren't edible and are only decorative, and they're not even my favorite decoration either. C tier. The massive mushroom trees of the mushroom forest create one of the coolest ecosystems in all of Subnautica, and calling them mushrooms is fitting, seeing that these seem to fill the enigmatic role of fungi in being hard to classify. The PDA reveals that these trees are microcosms of many organisms in both competition and cohabitation with each other. Supposedly, the trunk is made of coral colonies up to 50,000 years old, with the caps being more or less similar to the fungus we know on Earth. I'll maintain that because coral is an animal and not a plant, that would make these trees mostly fauna and not flora, and the idea of these massive structures being made of coral colonies is certainly unlikely at best. They tend to be wider rather than taller for a number of reasons, and the largest coral on Earth is only 5.5 meters tall compared to a whopping 34 meters wide. Still, the fantasy vibe of the forest as a whole is unmatched, and if I weren't such a bad sea moth pilot, I would build my base here every single time. Overall, still an S tier. The peeper is the adorable face of the Subnautica franchise, much like Tracer was to Overwatch or Jeremiah is to Raft. These guys are mostly notable for their large compound eyes that are apparently able to discern a number of colors underwater, which is different from many of the animals we've covered so far. It also has powerful fins to launch it into the air. Other than that, the PDA states that many of the peeper's features serve no discernible purpose. Overall, peepers are a viable herbivorous prey fish that fill roughly the same niche as many sunfishes and bream. Because they are as iconic as they are, they're still going to go in the S tier. The oculus is the peeper's goth cousin that hasn't left the room in too long and is now suffering the consequences. And the PDA even describes allopatric speciation for how these guys came to be. Where the peeper's compound eye could detect colors, apparently the oculus has superior night vision and a phobia of light. Additionally, the oculus has some cool tendril-like tail that it can regrow so it can more easily avoid predators, which is a cool detail that I wish we got to see in action. The peeper may be iconic, but I think the oculus is a much cooler design from a biological standpoint. They're also the best fish to put in your bioreactor, so do with that what you will. They're going in the S tier. The pink cap is a terrestrial fungus that you can use for decor. That is literally all there is to it. B tier. Purple pine cones are apparently a rare flora species that you can find in parts of the mushroom forest. I found one in my Let's Play, and I have received several comments informing me how rare that is. You can break them to get salt, but you can't even scan them to learn more, so simply because they exist, they're going in B tier. Pygmy fans are a normal fan plant found in a few biomes. They're pretty good aquarium decor. B tier. Rabbit rays are one of the first animals you'll encounter in a Subnautica playthrough, and they're one of my personal favorite critters. They're a cute pelagic ray that apparently is an example of convergent evolution between 4546b and Earth. A tier. Where the peeper is the cute, approachable mascot of these oceans, the Reaper Leviathan is the much more intimidating cousin that your mother warned you about. These massive animals are well known for their ability to jump scare their prey, which is seemingly limited to your favorite streamers and gamers. According to the PDA, the Reaper is almost all muscle with very little brain, no morality, and a lot of teeth, which seems fairly accurate to how they act in game. Supposedly, Reapers also use echolocation with their roar, but we never get to see that function in game. I wish that we saw more of Reapers hunting things other than the player, but they are still a cool design for a massive predator. For how iconic they are, the Reaper Leviathans are going in the S tier. Red eye-eyes are the lava zone version of normal eye-eyes that we talked about earlier, and once again, all of my previous analysis stands, but apparently these guys use thermal vision instead of light vision. I can't imagine that being anything other than blinding in such a hot environment, but it's still a huge waste of energy. The vision change is not enough to change its score compared to the normal eye-eye. C tier. Redwort is a fairly ubiquitous plant throughout the medium-depth biomes. The PDA says it's a common plant that's a staple in the diet of many of the smaller herbivores, although its design reminds me more of a Christmas tree worm than any marine plant species I'm familiar with. That being said, it's not impossible, and it would have plenty of surface area for photosynthesis. B tier. Probably my single most favorite organism in Subnautica, the reefback Leviathan is the gentle giant we all know and love. Maybe I love it because the PDA implies it's an invertebrate, and I'm inherently biased towards inverts, but that being said, I don't think the reefback's design is suitable for any large creature that relies on an exoskeleton for structure. Most of its body is covered in a thick, chitinous shell, kind of like what you would find on crabs or barnacles, and it supports a whole micro-ecosystem on its back, which honestly is just really cool. I will forever love the reefbacks for their aesthetic design and their in-game behavior, although their organismal biology isn't necessarily the best. They are fairly loud too, so be warned if you're choosing to build your base in the red grasses. They're still my favorite, so they're going in S tier. Reginald is an objectively funny name for a fish. These are another small herbivorous prey fish species found in the mid-depth biomes, and they're also distant cousins of the peeper. The only notable features of a Reginald are its brightly colored tail that's apparently linked to mating behavior, and the fact that this is the best fish for eating. A solid overall fish. A tier. The regress shell is another decorative plant found all over 4546b, including being one of the plants you can find on a reefback. Nothing about it is particularly unique or eye-catching, and while the design is more similar to any filter-feeding worm than a true plant, it's still a nice decoration, so it's going in C tier. River prowlers are the closest we get to any truly pelagic eel-like species in the game, with their long cartilaginous torsos and their fast agile movement. While these are already significantly more believable than their ampial cousins, the river prowler also imitates some of the behaviors of the Reaper Leviathan, where it uses its tendrils to draw in and attack its prey, and I really like that continuity. They're quick, highly mobile, and entirely pelagic. I also like the fact that these are one of the few species representing the mesopredator layer of the food web, where they are the predator to some, but prey to others, which isn't something we actually get to see too frequently in this game. So because these guys are the best example of what eels are actually like, and because they have some cool additional ecology and food web ecology, the river prowler is going in the B tier. Next on the list is a critter I'm willing to bet you didn't know existed, the rock grub found in the mid-depth caves. Supposedly, these little guys are distant relatives of the sand sharks, and they use their little circle teeth to cut clumps of coral and seagrass. The PDA addresses their bioluminescence as being part of a mating strategy, so that only parts of the population glow at any given time, or it suggests that maybe being eaten is just part of their normal life cycle. Kind of a weird little incidental isopod type thing. A tier. The Rouge Cradle is the next decorative plant that you'll find in many of the deeper biomes. This plant has a glowing center with a red, lacy cage around it, but we don't know too much about it beyond that. Further information would definitely help me assess how viable and accurate it is as a plant, but I do like the way it looks, so B tier. Sand sharks are an armored mesopredator that you'll find lurking around the red grasses, and these little fellows can burrow into the sand to camouflage themselves and wait for prey to pass by for an ambush attack, which reminds me a fair amount of several species of nurse sharks. My only gripe with the sand sharks is that its PDA entry lists these small appendages as feet, when in reality, it's more likely that these are something closer to an ossicle that you would find in a sea star or urchin that would help it manipulate its environment, and that also fits better with the idea of their plated dorsal side not having the same level of armor on their ventral side. Beyond that, I think they're a cool little mesopredator in one of my favorite biomes. A tier. Sea dragon leviathans are the largest living creatures you'll encounter in these parts of 4546b, and they are massive at an extreme 112 meters long. They're also one of the most aggressive creatures, and they're likely to hunt down other leviathans by forcing them into the lava caves to boil them alive, so that's festive. Supposedly, the sea dragon leviathan is one of the oldest species on the planet, and their populations are dwindling, potentially down to single digits. And while the PDA mentions that it's not unusual for large predators to have small populations, it's, quote, possible that the species may be nearing extinction, to which my answer as a biologist is, if you only have single-digit numbers in your population, you're essentially already extinct due to genetic bottlenecking. Without hammering in too much of the hard science, it would take some pretty extreme intervention and a massive change in habitat to make the dragon population truly sustainable long-term. Complicated biology and my personal dislikes aside, I do think the dragons are amazing aesthetically, and I like what they contribute to the player's experience, so we're gonna balance all of those factors into an even A tier. Without trying to spoil too much of the game, the Sea Emperor Leviathan is a lot more complicated than it initially seems. Not only is the Emperor telepathic, they seemingly have true telepathy compared to the Mesmer's mimicry. But also, the PDA literally says that the specimen size categories had to be adjusted upwards to accommodate how large these creatures are. That's even more impressive when you consider that they're filter feeders, much like the largest animals on our planet. I really love the Sea Emperor Leviathan for other reasons that I won't go into right now, and I love some of their late game interactions. So my scientific judgment is definitely outweighed by what they bring to the game overall. They're the cream of the crop and definitely an S tier animal. As much as I absolutely adore the reefback leviathans, the sea treader leviathan is a close second for my favorite leviathan class animal. They're funky big guys with only 2 legs, because that long leg in the front is actually a snout that helps them siphon up detritus from the seafloor. I love the way they stomp around, and just in case you didn't know, they're actually a renewable source of shale outcroppings, which can be useful for mid to late game farming. I think the reveal of finding sea treaders for the first time is one of the most magical experiences in Subnautica, and I wouldn't change anything about these guys. S tier for sure. According to the PDA, the sea crown is a close relative of the membrane tree, except this unique plant's bulbous cavity is filled with an array of bacteria rather than different coral species. I love the visual design of the sea crown, and it almost reminds me of bladderwrack seaweed on a larger scale. While I love the aesthetic of the sea crown, I just wish they were easier to find so that I could use them for base decoration more consistently in a normal playthrough. Beyond that, I could see this being a much more viable organismal design than the membrane tree, and it obviously has some important gameplay elements. Overall, it's a solid decoration that I would like more information on. A tier. I really want to like the shuttle bug, but I really dislike the fact that we never get to see them fulfill their intended purpose, which is to be a detritivore on cave floors. Scavengers are an undeniably essential part of any food web, and while I love the fact that they're included in the game in some way, it irks me that that behavior is never actually demonstrated in-game. So as much as I'm here for a good bottom feeder, the shuttle bug simply isn't it, and for that, they're landing in C tier. Sky rays are the only airborne creature we encounter in Subnautica, and their appearance is somewhat more akin to a bat than a bird, with the exception of their very bird-like heads. They have a seed-based diet, and that helps explain some of the spread of plant life around the planet. This is a perfectly feasible design, and they're pretty cute. A tier. If this were a tier list ranking how goofy the Subnautica creatures were, then the spadefish would easily be at the top of that list. But this is more about marine ecology, and the spadefish isn't all that interesting through that lens. It's more or less a slightly more pelagic flounder that's also herbivorous. I like the fact that they are more likely to school, but overall they're still a pretty standard fish. B tier. 4546B's worst version of a morel, these speckled rattlers are a fungus-like plant that you can find on either island. According to the PDA, they contain large spores that rattle when the plant is shaken, although we aren't certain whether it's used to evade predation or encourage it in hopes of spreading those spores. Again, this is a fairly standard and believable plant design. I just don't like the way they look. C tier. The same is more or less true for the spiked horngrass, which is another decorative plant species found in the mid-depth biomes. These guys are apparently genetically similar to the red seagrass, but these ones evolved to house their root systems in rigid structures. There's not really too much advantage to that, and it arguably limits the function of what roots are actually meant to do. There could be an argument that it's an evolved defense for many of these small herbivores around the same habitats though, so I'm willing to let it slide. B tier. The spinefish is the deep water equivalent of the much more vibrant hoopfish, and while I respect that it has the same behaviors and niche as its cousin, I really don't like the spinefish design. The idea of albinism evolving in cave fishes is certainly something that happens in real life, but something about the spinefish in particular makes me unhappy. Maybe it's just my pent-up resentment that so many of the fishes in the deeper biomes are just albinistic, less interesting versions of their original fish. But the spinefish is really nothing special. C tier. Strangely, the decorative spotted dockleaf found in some of the deeper biomes has some of the most well-thought-out ecology, including an actual description of using herbivores to help spread and transmit seeds as a reproductive strategy. According to the PDA, these are simple aquatic plants that have chemicals in their leaves to neutralize poisons and acids that are found in other organisms, and that's what makes them such an attractive snack to the fish it uses to spread. I like this evolutionary strategy, and I like the way it gives this plant an actual place and niche in a more complicated food web. I just don't love its appearance as much as some of the other decorative plants, so it's going in the A tier. Also in the plant world, I'm going to lump Geordie's tongue and spotted reeds together because they're both incidental decorative plants that aren't scannable and thus don't really contribute in any meaningful way aside from being nice to look at, so they're both going in the C tier. Another potentially controversial opinion, but I really love the stalkers. Sure, they look very toothy, but they give off very much the same vibes as a barracuda. As long as you don't mess with them, they're unlikely to mess with you. Especially because in-game, you can easily distract them with a spare piece of scrap metal, or even hand-feed them a peeper to make them non-aggressive towards you. These guys are another excellent example of a mesopredator that is actually adapted to the environment it lives in with high maneuverability, a snout for catching prey in crevices, and compound eyes for hunting in low-light conditions. I do believe that stalkers are one of the best examples of a creature that is entirely alien, but still believable to the extent that I could see something similar actually existing. And for that, they're going into the S tier. That being said, farming teeth for enameled glass is an absolute chore before you get a scanner. The table coral found in some of the shallower biomes is a fairly standard plate coral. I'd believe this exists, but I'm not certain how useful it is in crafting electronics. A tier. I hate tiger plants. They shoot little projectiles at you, they can destroy your bases and your vehicles just by existing, and they're annoying. Plus, the only way to get rid of them is by ramming them repeatedly with your Seamoth, or grinding them to smithereens with a prawn drill arm. Their ecology isn't even interesting enough to make up for it in any way. Apparently, any critters they take out will eventually decompose and fertilize their bodies, but most of the nutrients would be washed away long before contributing too heavily to the tiger plant's growth. I hate them. D tier. In the growing list of organisms I'm willing to bet you didn't know existed, this fungal parasite called a tree leech does exactly what you would think it does from the name. They're attached to the mushroom trees and roots, and apparently their giant gaping maw serves no known purpose. Instead, it just dissolves a hole into the side of the mushroom tree and absorbs its nutrients from there. Fungus-like things continue to be weird. C tier. While the in-game description for the veined nettle calls it a plant, it's definitely at least inspired by real-life fan corals. And once again, corals are animals, not plants. Beyond that, this is a fairly believable and reasonable organismal design, and they are one of my favorite aquarium decorations. They're found all over the seabed, and I like the way they sway in the water. B tier. Also in the list of my favorite aquarium decorations is the violet bow, a plant that glows a beautiful purple. There's nothing particularly noteworthy about these plants aside from the fact that their PDA entry is one of the only ones to show a proper plant cell structure. A tier. The last terrestrial organism in my list is the voxel shrub, a small bush with bright pink flowers that you can use as base decor, and it is easily my favorite filler plant when it comes to decorating. Again, these are fairly standard and believable plant designs, and I will be putting them into every plant pot I make. A tier. It's hard to assess the validity of warpers because they're an entirely constructed and bioengineered species. They were never natural to begin with, and are arguably more machine than they are animal. But from a gameplay perspective, I hate warpers. They scare me far more frequently than any of the Leviathans. They'll teleport out of nowhere just to mess with me, and I'm certain of that. Warpers are cool in lore and world building, but I absolutely hate encountering them. A tier. And finally, to round it off, we have the writhing weed, which is another vibrant decor plant found in the safe shallows. The PDA claims these plants live in symbiosis with the surrounding coral species that form around their base, but gives us no further details on what that symbiosis could mean for either species. They're one of my favorite outdoor decorations, and their saturated bright hues are definitely an iconic part of the safe shallows, so the writhing weed is going in the A tier. And there you have it, a marine ecologist's full tier list of every living organism in Subnautica. I tried to balance my scientific expertise with my knowledge of the game, and my experience having played it for a few hundred hours. Please let me know your thoughts, what rankings you do or don't agree with, and also what you would put at the top of your tier list. Anyways, I think that's everything for me for now. Please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. It really helps me out. I hope to see you all again soon, but until then, have a great day.